Yesterday and this past weekend, people across the country took time to remember the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In doing so, however, many failed to remember him correctly. Rather than remembering his radical, often unpopular leadership, many people remembered a placated, non-threatening, and even sanitized version of Dr. King. That version, which many find to be more palatable, is what's often celebrated. That whitewashed version fails to remember that by the time of Dr. King's assassination, the FBI considered him the most dangerous man in America. Today, we set the record straight. We set the record straight on Dr. King, his life, and his legacy. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
While many may be familiar with some of Dr. King's uplifting quotes, such as "I Have a Dream" speech, many of Dr. King's speeches contain radical thoughts that would likely be rejected and censored in many of our churches and schools today. Dr. King frequently spoke out against what he named the three evils of militarism, capitalism, and racism. He decried the Vietnam War. He critiqued the ills of capitalism. He advocated for civil disobedience and direct action that broke the established laws of the land. Dr. King even supported economic policies that included the redistribution of wealth, a guaranteed job for every American citizen, and a universal basic income. He also often talked about the poor and the poor's right to affordable housing and basic necessities. Today, we're asking, how do Dr. King's own radical words speak into our current racial, economic, and political realities? Here for our lead-off discussion is Dr. Karlos Hill. He is the Department Chair of African and African American Studies at the University of Illinois, and he's also the author of multiple books, including Beyond the Rope: The Impact of Lynching on Black Culture and Memory. Good morning and welcome back, Dr. Hill.
Thank
So yesterday was the official King holiday that we celebrate. Saturday was his actual 93rd, or would have been his 93rd birthday. And, all last week, the weekend, and going into this week, we're going to be celebrating and acknowledging Dr. King. But for many, the Dr. King that we're talking about is this kind of whitewashed, sanitized version that's taught in history classes throughout this country. Help us understand how Dr. King is in many ways quite opposite of the version that we're taught in high school.
Yes, I mean, I'll start with where you began, which is we remember King as a great man, which he was, but in the last year of his life, and Tavis Smiley, my dear brother Tavis Smiley, wrote a beautiful book, Death of a King, that tells the story of that last year of his life. And in that last year of his life, King was at his low point. America had turned his back on him. Black community, to a certain extent, had turned their back on him because of some of the unpopular things he had begun to say. And Areva, you began to mention them, but probably the most polarizing thing that King said that sort of garnered him enemies, particularly in the White House, is he began to talk about the United States as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And that ran afoul of how Americans, particularly white Americans, thought of themselves. And so King, in a very short period of time, went from this beloved figure who was helping America figure out its race problem to a man who was condemning America on the world stage. And for that, it was unforgivable. And he lost a lot of respect and clout amongst the political establishment, the left, and as well as among Black people. And so he was at his low point. And so when King says in his last speech that I might not get there with you, but I've seen the promised land, what he's talking about is he knows that the FBI and others are after him, and he maybe have days, maybe minutes to live. And so he had to tell the world that there was something bigger out there, bolder out there to fight for. And so King, that was the radical King talking that we tend to forget in his last year.
Help us, and thank you so much. And you're right, Tavis Smiley, who now is the owner of KBLA Talk 1580, and I have a show on that station, and you join me one Saturday to talk about issues of race and where we are in this country. Help us understand that evolution process, because what you just described as king in his later years wasn't the early king that is often celebrated. So what happened in the evolution of his life that led him from where we first start to recognize him as this great leader to someone who at the end of his life, and I saw one report that said his approval rating was like, somewhere under 20%. As you just said, he was a very, very unpopular, not only with white establishment, but even in the Black community, he was quite unpopular. So what's that evolution look like?
We have to remember that when King entered the movement, he was, for all intents and purposes, a student. I mean, he had just graduated from seminary, 25 years old. And his first church in Alabama, in Montgomery, is where he learns from some veteran civil rights movement leaders like Edie Nixon and others, Rosa Parks. And so in early 1950s, King is becoming the king that we more or less recognize today, the person who talked about the blood community, the person who talked about civil non-disobedience, the person who was leading marches and sit-ins. That's the king that we are familiar with, and we want to talk about, because that king is palatable. The one talking about Black girls and boys holding hands with white girls and white boys. That is the vision that America likes. But King in his last year, right? He had been in the movement for 14 years. He had sat in and fought in Birmingham, in Atlanta, and all across the South, and began to fight in what we would call the North, in Chicago, for housing rights for Black people. By the end of his life, the Poor People's March in April of 1968, where he had realized that in order to fight racial injustice, he had to fight economic injustice. And so the Poor People's March, the Poor People Campaign became the most important thing in his activism. And so there was a slow and steady growth towards King as a sort of a race man, a race leader, toward understanding that at the root of America is violence, militarism, right, and capitalism that was suffocating and creating tremendous suffering. And so his antidote to that was universal health care, was a universal living wage, right, or income, right? He began to prescribe economic solutions to the problem of racial justice. And for that, he became a threat, because he couldn't necessarily be controlled in the ways that he had been controlled. They had attempted to control him before. And so King began to realize, I believe, his power, even though his popularity was diminished, he was drawing strength. Right? When you listen to his last speech, you know that he was beginning to draw strength, even in his isolation. And so King, profound figure, we choose to misunderstand his last years because we prefer, the King talking about Black girls and boys holding hands instead of these hard questions of economic justice.
That's a good point. You said we choose. It's a conscious choice that's being made to remember that part of his legacy that is more acceptable. Let's go back to that point you made where you said perhaps one of the reasons he was the most despised by the political establishment was him speaking out about American violence. So was that violence in other countries? Was that our war, the war machine that America has? Was that wars that we were fighting in other countries? Or what is that violence that he was speaking out against?
I mean, King was much like Muhammad Ali, King was an early opponent of the Vietnam War and began to criticize the United States position, right, in terms of the Vietnam War. And so as it began to escalate in the late 60s or mid to late 60s, King is beginning to draw attention to that and to connect the struggle for civil rights in the US, Black people, with these struggles happening across the globe, not just in excuse me, not just in Africa, but also in parts of the Middle East. And so King is seeing the movement, this Black freedom movement, in much more expansive dimensions than he had before, even though he had won in the late 1950s a Nobel Peace Prize. I think by the 1960s, he had really come to understand fundamentally that the problems facing Black people in America were problems that existed throughout because of capitalism.
Okay.
And so I think there was a maturity of thought that occurred, having been, in struggle for more than 14 years, right, since he was 25 years old. And so King, we have to imagine a King who came into the movement as a student and leaves and is taken away from us, right, a statesman. He was a statesman at 39 years old, but he started the movement in earnest at 25. And so he had nearly a 15-year maturation process. And in that time, King comes to understand the problems of America much more deeply than he did, I think, at the beginning.
And so we know, Dr. Hill, that Mahatma Gandhi had a big influence on King and his whole, theology around nonviolence. Help us understand how that, approach to, racism, this nonviolent approach is often, again, sanitized in a way, because a lot of people say, well, Dr. King, believed in nonviolent protests, and they use that to juxtapose what we may see in terms of today, Black Lives Matter or other protest movement, as somehow suggesting that Dr. King would be disapproving of the activists and the movement that we see today. Is that a fair assessment, you think?
Dr. King is all for nonviolent direct action. But people need to understand that is not a passive strategy. Dr. King's approach to nonviolent civil disobedience was very aggressive, was very confrontational. In fact, the Birmingham movement of 1963 was called Project C, was called Project Confrontation. Because the goal was to make themselves a problem for the establishment, force a confrontation between Bull Connor, right, and activists. And they knew that Bull Connor would use extreme violence. And they knew that if it got recorded and beamed to American households, maybe some change could happen. And so we need to understand that even though King was nonviolent and he did not want to engage in violence, he understood that in engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, violence would occur. And that violence would shame the enemies of the movement and perhaps shame the political establishment in doing what they already should have done, which was provide voting rights, civil rights, and all the other rights Black people were being denied at that time. And so we need to move beyond thinking that nonviolent civil disobedience is sort of a passive strategy. No, in fact, King and those who were organized that movement organized it and designed it to create a confrontation.
And that confrontation, we saw that confrontation at the march on the Selma, the Pettus Bridge. We saw the dogs. We saw the brutality that happened on that bridge. What was significant about that? We often celebrate that in the context of John Lewis, because John Lewis was a young man, a student at the time. And why is that march so pivotal to understanding King's legacy?
There's been a lot of books written about it. There's a lot of great King historians, past and present, who have talked about that. I would say, I would put it in the context of the Cold War and the sort of geopolitical struggles, battles between America and the USSR at the time, Russia today, and the ways in which the images of Black people being brutalized by police officers in the South, how that furthered a narrative of America is not truly the home of democracy, follow us into this communist future. That played a big role in terms of how the government responded to this. Shortly thereafter, there was, significant conversations and ultimately policy changes that occurred. But I think seminal to all of it was sort of King's King's presence, right? This man of peace, peaceably doing something that all Americans should be able to do peaceably, protest, nonetheless, with children, with older people, elderly people, and then just people, police brutalized them for no reason. And so it became sort of an unpalatable, because again, this is the early era of TV, right? When these images really everybody in the world saw them. And so we didn't have an internet where we're so saturated with images. And if you miss something, it's like, oh, wow, you missed something, but it's not a surprise because there are literally billions and billions of searches that happen every day and information that is put out on social media, the internet every day. And so we are saturated, but this is a moment where America focused. Yeah. And I think for a moment was embarrassed by how vicious, right, American racism has been for Black people.
We know Selma, the movie, Ava DuVernay, made this incredible movie about the march and the planning and leading up to the march. I want to talk a little, Dr. Hill, about Black folks, because it's hard to get, for me, an accurate read on where the African American community was during this 15-year period, King's life, not his entire life, but the 25-year-old student that comes on the scene, who then evolves into the statesman, as you described him, by the age of 39. How was he received by the African American community? Because at the same time, we have the rise of the Black Panther Party that's happening. We have Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. We've talked some on the show with you about that movement that was happening. So help us put King in the context of today, when you think about where were Black folks back then vis-a-vis King?
I mean, I think we have to think about the movement as this sort of complex tapestry, right? Where there are radical elements, there are moderate elements, right? There are conservative elements, right? And I think King would be, squarely kind of in the middle of that, right? He's someone who, isn't espousing legalism as the way forward, like we're going to get these laws changed, and once we get those laws changed, the world will be better. No, he's saying that that's a part of it, but we also need these deeper, more systemic changes connected to the economy, connected to, again, creating a living wage, healthcare.
Let me stop you, Dr. Hill, because you just said King would be considered a moderate. Is that in the context of what we think of, like when we think of these centrist Democrats, these moderate?
No. Of his time, in terms of the movement, in terms of the Black freedom struggle.
Okay.
So that's what I'm saying. Not forget our political map.
The way we think of moderates today. That's not what you're talking
about. No. Okay. No. That's out. Okay. King, in terms of the political culture of the Black freedom movement, I think I think we could see him more as a centrist. He's what he's arguing for is for us ultimately, to put this very simply, that America fully integrate Black people into it. And that America, in addition to doing that, America needed deep economic reforms. And so King is a reformist, not a radical, as a Black Panther Party or a League of Black Revolutionary Workers who were calling for the end of America as we knew it, not an integration into it. And so King was decidedly right to the left of that. Right. He was not someone who was calling for the end of America. He wanted to reform America. And so that's why I'm saying in terms of the Black freedom movement, he was much more a sort of moderate figure. There were others who thought that once you included Black people into the system, right, the work was done. That's a more conservative position. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just trying to help you to understand sort of the constellation, the tapestry of positions that there was in the Black freedom movement. And that's an oversimplification, but I just want you to understand that King was not, even when he began to call for economic justice, wasn't a radical figure within the movement.
And so where were, if you know the majority of Black folks during this period, so you've kind of described these three different kind
Yeah.
of ideologies that were prevalent in the late 50s and 60s. Where were the majority of African Americans? Were they squarely with Dr. King and this kind of reform notion, like we integrate and we reform the existing system? Was
Hmm.
that the mindset of most Black folks?
You know, Areva, I, I don't know if I could. I'm smart enough to tell you that right now.
You're way smart. You're definitely smart enough, but you may need to go like read another history book, but you definitely are smart enough.
Okay, well, let me say this, my dear sister. I don't think about it that way. I think about the Black freedom movement as a sort of as different moments, and at those different moments, there were different things were required, right? So in the late 50s, early 60s, what is at the forefront of folks is voting rights and ending segregation, and so that is paramount. But as those things begin to occur, the energy of the movement shifts, and it not only does it shift maybe from the deep south, it shifts to the north, to the Midwest, to the urban Northeast, and the struggles there look very different, but the same than the struggles in the South. And I think in that, going back to something you asked me earlier, in that context where King is sort of seen as this Black minister, seen as someone who is nonviolent first and foremost, the ways in which Black people were being brutalized by police officers in Oakland and Los Angeles and all over this country, that didn't jive with them because they were the boots of the police were on necks. And so they were in this posture of fighting back, resisting, right, that oppression. And so even though I deeply believe Dr. King sympathized and empathized and did all one could to support, his voice wasn't, I think, from particularly from the 1966, 1967, when King visited Chicago and Los Angeles, and he's jeered by some Blacks who call him the Lord because Dr. King coming was an event, right? And when he came, people expected things to change, and obviously, given the kind of entrenched racism, right, that exists, those things didn't, those barriers didn't change. The police brutality didn't change. The economic injustice didn't change.
Was he speaking out though, Dr. Hill, when he came to Chicago and Los Angeles in those last 2 years of his life? Would he have been, speaking out against that kind of police brutality and what folks in those cities like Chicago and LA were experiencing, Black folks?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you just have to go back and read. I don't want to get into all that, but you just have to read those speeches. He's cognizant of the audience. He's cognizant of that. Chicago is different than Selma.
But you're saying there were Black folks who were booing him for all practical purposes. And why was that? What was their sense?
I think that there was a kind of disenchantment with where things lie after nearly a decade of activism. If we go back to the Montgomery bus boycotts, 1955, and we fast forward to the Voting Rights Act, which is one of the high points of the civil rights movement, 10 years had passed, things had changed, but things had still almost fundamentally stayed the same. Black people were still the poorest in the country, still the most vulnerable to every social ill there is in this country. And so there was a way in which things had changed, but they had remained the same. And there was a deep unsettledness about that, and a deep anger and resentment about that. And the young people of this country, particularly those that we are familiar with, like the Black Panther Party, who organized CORE, SNCC, even those old civil rights, those much more veteran civil rights organizations like SNCC and CORE, they began to become radicalized and call for much more deeper and systemic change in this country. And again, King is recognizing this. King is a part of this. And as those voices, I believe, and this is me, Karlos Hill, studying King, as those voices become louder and calling and championing for economic justice, I think King, as a student of this movement, began to shift that way, even though I know his heart was already there, right? But his politics, and particularly how he talked about these things in public, I think they became much more pronounced. And you only need to know that the Poor People's Campaign, how it evolved, to help understand King's sort of overall trajectory.
And just lastly, Dr. Hill, before I let you go, Dr. King was very isolated in that last year. And I've read that, he was obviously, had angered the white political establishment for speaking out, as you said, about militarism and capitalism. But he was also alienated from some of those very civil rights leaders that had been a part of the movement. And, I've read some books where he's very, very isolated. What was that those last years like for him, being ostracized by both whites and blacks?
I think it was very difficult. I think it weighed on him. But I think he was bigger than all of it because of the ways in which he talked about what he had experienced. And, leading up to his last speech, he's beginning to say, all that is swirling around me, I'm not paying attention to that because I have my eyes on the promised land. I've seen the promised land. I'm not going to be able to get there with you, but we will, as a people, get to the promised land. And so at the moment that he is taken away from us, even though he's at his lowest in terms of popularity, he's at his biggest. His spirit is at his biggest at the end of his life before he is so, shamefully taken away from us. And I often think about what would Dr. King say about us, given that when he died, he was at his lowest popularity. We created a holiday in his name. And for 39 years, we have celebrated the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. But I wonder, what would Dr. King say about us who have created a holiday in his name? Have we actually lived up to the values that he represented, to the life that he led? Could we honestly say that we have authentically celebrated Dr. King for 39 years? That's the question that I ask myself. If he were to come back today and look at what we've done in his name, would he be happy with us or patently disappointed?
Yeah. Profound question. I think for all of us to reflect on. A great point. Great place for us to, for me to say goodbye to you, Dr. Hill. Always a pleasure. I learned so much talking to you. Always inspired and motivated. I love that you left us with that question. I don't know the answer. I think many folks, when I was reading something, in that last speech where he talked about segregation, and we look at our neighborhoods, we look at our schools in some ways as segregated today as they were when he was giving that speech, in the late 1960s. So I think if we had a scorecard, we would definitely get an F in some of those areas. No doubt about it.
And that's the standard that we have to set. When we celebrate Dr. King, it is not about coming together for a breakfast, a brunch, or a dinner. Celebrating him authentically is living how he lived and fighting the way that he fought for the least of these. That's celebrating Dr. King. And that's the only thing that he would be pleased by, is that each of us have made that commitment, the same commitment that he made.
Wow. Thank you. Appreciate you again, Dr. Hill, for helping us understand and hopefully celebrate. I'm really annoyed, I think, by the sanitized way in which we talk about Dr. King and how we leave out all of those important parts of what he stood for, particularly around poor people and around capitalism. So hopefully these kind of conversations help folks to start thinking about King in a much bigger, much more complex way. And, just stop holding on to that, like you say, white kids holding hands with black kids.
And that ain't a bad thing, but that's not the whole
good.
thing.
And we're glad they
the whole thing.
We should aspire to do that, but we've got to aspire so much more, so much. His legacy is so much more. But again, thank you, Dr. Hill.
Well, I love coming on. Thank you for having me.
All right, my next guest, we're talking about how would Dr. King feel about where we are today. His son, his Martin Luther King III, said he wouldn't feel too good about where we are in this country around voting rights. And he essentially asked us not to celebrate his father's birthday on yesterday, but to really use the holiday as a way to push for voting rights legislation. I want to bring on my next guest. She's a civil rights attorney. She's an activist. She's the executive director of Wayfinder Foundation. She's the former Minneapolis NAACP president. Her name is Nekima Levy Armstrong. Nekima, good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you.
The biggest headline coming out of the MLK celebration was from his children. MLK the third at that rally in Washington yesterday, where he basically invoked his dad's letter from that Birmingham jail, in which Dr. King described the white moderate as Black Americans' greatest stumbling block in our stride towards freedom. And King the Third used that to critique Manchin and Sinema for not supporting eradicating the filibuster to pass voting rights legislation. I'm sure you saw parts or all of that rally yesterday. What do you think about, how King the Third said we should be remembering his dad?
Well, I think that it was a powerful rallying cry, no celebration without legislation, to remind people of what Dr. King really stood for. As you were discussing earlier, we have really sanitized Dr. King's memory and his legacy, and unfortunately, it's been whitewashed. Dr. King was a radical who spoke truth to power, who walked the walk and talked the talk, but also called out the hypocrisy that was going on in America during that time. And we see that right now with what's happening with the stalled voting rights legislation. And the fact that all these folks are lining up claiming to be allies to our community, but when the rubber meets the road, they won't put any real skin in the game in advancement of our civil rights and our human rights as Black folks.
Yeah, in that Birmingham letter, beautifully written letter. Everyone, if you haven't read it, you should read it. You can Google it and find it online. Dr. King says he was surrounded by people who told him to wait until a more convenient time and to use more agreeable methods. And again, MLK the third used that line from his dad's letter to talk about what's happening today, where some senators are saying, we need to wait. This isn't the time. We need to build consensus. We need, partisanship. We need GOP members to be on board. We need to use more agreeable methods other than eliminating the filibuster, other than carving out a space in the filibuster. So, remnants of that speech, as if Dr. King was writing that letter today, right? You could hear those same words being used. But I do want to ask you this, Nekima. Someone wrote me an email and they said, look, Areva, we get it. But the news all day yesterday were people, bashing, trying to humiliate, trying to shame these two Democratic senators, Manchin and Sinema, into submission. And they said that's a failed strategy. Do you think the activists are getting it wrong with the approach they're taking to try to get movement on the filibuster?
Well, I think that they're taking an approach by any means necessary in order to accomplish their goals. I mean, we literally have two senators standing in the way of this historic legislation that would hopefully undo what has happened over the last several years, where 19 jurisdictions have passed more restrictive voting laws. And then we saw the Supreme Court in 2013 gut pertinent portions of the Voting Rights Act. And so the clock has been rolled back in terms of our voting rights. And two senators are essentially standing in the way. And we have seen the impacts of partisan politics and the difficulties to get things done in Washington. There's so much vitriol, so much negativity. I mean, this is really an opportunity to shift the tide in a different direction. But we know what the flip side is, right? If they get rid of the filibuster here, then what is that going to mean when Republicans have legislation that they're trying to advance?
And that's been the argument by these two senators, particularly Sinema has been saying, look, if we do it, what's going to happen when they're in control? But I want to go back to what you said. You said by any means necessary. We saw some activists last week when Biden went to Atlanta with VP Harris and other, the NAACP president was there, Mark Morial from National Urban League was there. Other prominent civil rights leaders joined the president and vice president, but there were some local groups, some civil rights groups, voting rights groups who boycotted and then took that opportunity on that day to criticize the president and vice president by saying it was too little too late and that they had leaned in to the infrastructure bill and had gotten it done, and that the White House hadn't used that same muscle, that same might to lean into voting rights. So you think that was an effective strategy to boycott that speech and then take that day to criticize the president?
Well, I think it depends on the outcome that they were hoping for, right? So on the one hand, they showed that folks are dissatisfied with what's happening with the Democratic Party, with what's happening with the President of the United States, and wanting them to act with a greater sense of urgency. Of course, the flip side are concerns about this showing fractures within the Democratic Party, but these fractures exist whether or not people show up to boycott events or they don't. Mm-hmm. And Black people in particular feel the effects of these fractures within the party, where our needs and our interests are often, on the back burner. And so I can understand why people would show up, why they would, say what they said and do what they did. But at the end of the day, we need to figure out, how are we going to come together and address these voting rights issues, address issues of poverty, address the wealth gap, address the education gap. I mean, the list goes on in terms of the things that Dr. King stood for that are still hanging in the balance when it comes to Black people. So no, we shouldn't be satisfied. We have to speak up and raise these concerns.
Yeah, on the voting rights piece, Nekima, I had a communication strategist, Democratic communication strategist on it, and he said he thought the messaging and the approach was all wrong, and that the activists needed to understand the math, and he wasn't being condescending, but he was saying the math is the math, and we got these two bottlenecks, Manchin and Sinema, and all this energy and focus that's been placed on them is misplaced. We need to think about, we're almost there. We got 50-50 in the Senate, and then we have Harris, but that we need two more. I mean, the reality is you can't get it done without a majority, and we need to focus on where do we pick up those additional senators in races and make that much more the focus than trying to browbeat these two individuals who seemingly, as much pressure gets put on them, they become more entrenched. I mean, Sinema gave a speech on Thursday before Biden basically saying, not just no, but hell no. So, I mean, it doesn't seem like the pressure is working. It seems like this is just driving them further and further away. So do you think we need to recalibrate our strategy?
I think it sounds good in theory, but the probability of any Republicans signing on with the Democrats.
He wasn't saying Republicans. He was saying we got to pick up 2 new seats in this midterm.
Oh, yes.
We've got to pick up more. The math is just not going to work out. And he's saying, look, these 2 people, at some point, you just got to recognize when you just don't have the numbers. And for all practical purposes, they are like having 2 Republican senators, even though they are Democrats.
Right. Absolutely. So I definitely agree that we need to pick up more Democratic senators who are in alignment with these values that we're saying are so important, because you can pick up 2 more Democrats, but they might be just like Sinema and Manchin, and we're still back at square one. Right. And so what happens in the midterm elections is going to be vital in terms of shifting the paradigm of what the future of voting rights will hold in this country. And as Dr. King's 13-year-old granddaughter said, the future of our country is at stake. And that's what it feels like right now in this moment in time.
It definitely feels that way, but I guess depending on who you talk to, they'll say, the future is in peril because of the Democrats. Republicans will say that the future of the country is in grave, there's grave concerns about the future of the country because of Joe Biden and the Democratic administration. We have such strident views on, this whole issue of democracy. And I heard a couple of Republicans say they care about voting rights, but the way that we are going about it in these 2 bills, in their opinion, is stripping the states of whatever control. And of course, activists fire back on that and say that, voting rights has always been under the province of the federal government. But I do want to ask you about this. So Lyndon B. Johnson, has this reputation of getting in people's faces, spitting in their faces, and, really just strong-arming Congress is the way he got the Voting Rights Bill of 1965 passed, because clearly it wasn't as if there were all these white people in the 60s ready to give Black folks, access to the ballot box then either. And so folks are comparing Johnson to Biden and saying Biden is not getting in people's faces. He's not, using that power of the presidency. Do you think it's a Biden problem?
I don't think that approach will actually work for Biden, because it doesn't seem to be his personality. mean, it's hard to choose one figure, in American history and say, if you're not doing it like this, then you're not doing it effectively. But I do think that Biden needs to make these issues a greater priority than he has thus far. And he needs to make good on some of his campaign promises, which did tend to appeal.
How does he do that, Nekima, if he doesn't have the numbers? And I'm equally frustrated, although I don't. Okay, we can debate about whether he leaned into it soon enough, right? But it's no doubt right now he's leaning into it. He's met with Congress. He's had these two people over for tea at the White House. I mean, he's gone to Atlanta. And short of being somebody that he's not, and I think you and I are in agreement, that's just not his personality. The man is not going to spit in your face and, call you names. That's just not who he is. And we elected him and we knew that about him. So
right.
What else from your perspective can he do?
Honestly, I think the best thing that he can do and the Democratic Party can do at this point is making sure that they shore up the numbers heading into the midterms. Okay. And there are a lot of concerns. He's going to have to get his rating up as well, because there are a lot of dissatisfied individuals. And we know that Donald Trump and his comrades capitalize off of the level of discontent within the Democratic Party. Yeah. So he's going to have to try to pull people together and broaden the scope of trying to identify who will be best to get in those seats in the Senate so that their agenda can actually move forward. But that's just the beginning from my perspective, given the long list of issues that our community continues to face.
Yeah, and people get dissatisfied, right? And they feel like, I voted, you told us to vote, he made all these promises, and then we got to tell them the reality of the presidency, right? The limitations, that the presidency is powerful. Yes, the most powerful person in some ways in the world, but yet in many ways, Biden said there are 50 presidents. Those senators are like individual presidents, and people get really upset when you have to give them that whole civics lesson about, yeah, he made all these promises, but it was all contingent upon there being the numbers to pass the legislation in the House and the Senate. And, we didn't talk a lot about the filibuster when Biden and Harris were running, right? We didn't talk about, were we going to eliminate it? Well, I guess there was some conversation. Biden said then he was kind of adverse to it. But even if as he's now come out in favor of it, he doesn't have the power individually to do anything about it. Before I let you go, Nekima, I do want to ask you, we're talking about the math, the numbers, right? All eyes were in Georgia before. Where do you think we can pick up two senators that are ideologically aligned with the Biden-Harris administration?
It's really difficult to say where we're going to get two senators who are going to be in alignment with the party. I want to look to the South. But in the South is where we've seen some of the greatest traction as far as rolling back our voting rights. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping that two people will emerge who care about our democracy, who care about civil rights, who care about people's access to the polls. Yeah. So your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, I'm looking at Ryan in Ohio. If Tim Ryan can win that election, we're hopeful about Philadelphia. That's an open seat. We know that Lieutenant Governor is running. There's an African-American, Malcolm Kenyatta, state senator, that's in that race for that Senate seat in Pennsylvania. But, Dr. Oz entered that race on the Republican side. And we know that personality and media personalities can have an impact on voters, even if their politics are crazy or, their experience is non-existent, just being a media figure. So I don't know about Pennsylvania, but we were hoping about Pennsylvania. Yeah, I mean, and particularly since what we saw in that governor's race in Virginia, right? So that race that was in the bag for Dems that we narrowly lost, and we saw how Republicans put that race together and beat the Dems. So I don't know about Pennsylvania. I don't know about Ohio. Ohio has always been, tough.
Right.
About a Democrat coming through in Ohio is tough, but.
Yeah, we just have to pray and gird up our loins and really hope that we get
work to do. Well, thank you, Nekima, for joining me. Thank you for the work you're doing. Obviously, the activists are going to be really busy because if we don't get those two pieces of legislation passed, and right now it's not looking good. I asked Cliff Albright, Black Voters Matter down in Georgia, what do the activists do? And The reality is they got to try to out-organize the county election officials, which is going to be somewhat tricky because Biden has told us it's not who votes, it's who's counting the votes, which has us
Absolutely.
all on edge.
And that's part of the Republican strategy. They have about 163 people in line to get elected positions to try to control what happens at the ballot box. So we have to be mindful and watchful of what's going on and deeply concerned.
Absolutely. All right, Nekima, always good to see you, my friend. We'll stay on this. So lots to talk about and lots to keep our eyes on as we head. And we know June and November are going to be here in a blink of an eye. So
absolutely,
we'll be on top of this. Thank you again. All right, my next guest is Minister Dominique R. He is the president and founder of the Next Generation Action Network. Good morning and welcome, Reverend Alexander.
How you doing, Areva?
I'm doing great. Thank you. I'm thinking about how everybody has been recognizing Dr. King over the last weekend or so. What did your organization do? How did you all acknowledge the life and legacy of Dr. King?
So we answered the call of MLK III and his family with joining the national campaign of delivering the rights to vote, right? So we joined the direct action. Our national policy director was with Dr. King and a number of people in Arizona. I wasn't able to go on the trip. But yet at the end of the day, what we did was we did a direct action outside of AT&T headquarters yesterday. Because AT&T headquarters has been directly tied, and their research has been directly tied towards supporting voter suppression. And we know out of the state of Texas, in my hometown, the state of Texas crafted one of the worst voter suppression laws that our country have seen. And we know AT&T during that time funded about $574,000 into our state legislature. And we know about them funding One American News from the testimony in front of Congress and a number of things. So we answered the call because we know, I always tell people, and I told somebody yesterday, I'm not worried about the dream of Dr. King. I'm worried about the nightmare that he clearly left us with in this country. And I think that if people start focusing on the nightmare and not the dream, we will actually understand the assignment and actually accomplish it.
How are folks on the ground feeling? I mean, given the work. So one thing that Dr. Hill said at the beginning of the show was when we think about the civil rights legislation that was passed, it was a 10-year period from 1955 to 1965 that we saw that legislation pass. So we think about the rollback of the voting rights legislation. It's been happening over a number of years. Are people ready to be in this battle for, if it takes the next 10 years to restore those voting rights that were, so important and were written into law in 1965, confirmed by the Supreme Court in numerous cases, but then rolled back by the very Supreme Court? I'm just wondering, are people feeling like if this is a 10-year fight, they're in it for 10 years?
Well, you know what? One of the things, Areva, I want to point out is that I was on a panel the other day with one of our state senators, Royce West. He said that this fight, because somebody posed that same question, this fight in Texas has been going on for almost 10 years. The state legislator 10 years ago had to, the actual walkout in the leaving the state. That wasn't our first time that our state legislator did that. They actually went to New Mexico the last time. This time they went to DC because, there was actually a Democrat that was in charge of the White House at that time. But this was actually a fight that dates back all the way from Texas passing the voter ID law. Right? They met with Obama well before this time. So what we need is that you talk about states like Georgia and Texas and different things. Georgia delivered, right? They delivered the last time. They organized in rural communities. They did what they can, but Georgia cannot hold on. States like Texas and Georgia cannot hold on. We deal with stuff much larger than just voting. It is not a coincidence that the man, the Oath Keeper leader, was here. He was arrested here in North Texas. That causes me very concerned, the fact that I raised my children and this man is literally here. We deal with hate in these states. And at the end of the day, the only way that we protect our families is through that ballot box and making sure that we have elected leaders that are not funding this hateful regime or whatever. So at the end of the day, we need our federal government to act now. We've been patient. And although I wasn't in those meetings 10 years ago, it's very well documented that this has been a continued issue. Every time they have to pass and reauthorize the Voter Rights Act, this conversation is brought up every 10 years. So that's why we're saying we can't wait no more.
I'm glad you mentioned what happened with the legislators from the state of Texas. We saw this summer them take those buses. They left to try to avoid the vote on some of these repressive laws in the state legislature in Texas. How are those legislators feeling? Because I know at the time I can remember seeing many of them were somewhat frustrated about the lack of meetings that they were able to get, frustrated about what was said in some of those meetings. Are they feeling like their act of civil disobedience by leaving the state, some of them being gone for 3-4 weeks at a time? I remember some of them got COVID. I mean, it was a really difficult time to travel. Are they feeling like that was worth it?
I think they're keeping on going. One of the state legislators said that Republicans are bringing an axe to the fight, and Democrats is bringing a kitchen knife to the fight. And the reality is that we had infrastructure, we had everything that was prioritizing the legislation that was keeping our democracy. And we feel like even with, this is one of the things that the activist community are feeling frustrated about. I remember back in August, last year in 2021, I probably traveled from DC back. I thought I needed to get a second house or whatever, as much as I was in DC. And activists, and that's the reason why they protested Atlanta, because I was a part of those national calls that did that. Because we told Biden is that we know politics. And these legislations that you're passing, like the infrastructure bill, is important to Republicans. We know the game of politics, leverage these bills to protect our democracy. But we didn't see him putting this strong of a stance. And I tell people all the time, I don't show no sympathy to a president in 2021 and 2022 because I know what LBJ did years ago. And I know he's
fairness though, and I was just asking Nekima this, Biden and Johnson, two different men in a totally different era. So is it fair to judge Biden by the standards of LBJ? Is that a fair comparison?
Well, I believe if Biden used that same energy that he used to be very aggressive and strong with African-American leaders. Remember the call that was leaked last year about the call? If he used that same energy with Kristen Sinema and Manchin.
What can he say to them? It seems like, and we can agree that the timing, it seems like they got on board late. Like you just said, you guys were telling them in August, and we didn't see a manifestation of them working. Maybe they were behind the scenes, but give them the benefit of the doubt. But what is it that they can say? What can Biden say to Sinema and Manchin today that he hasn't already said that you think will be effective?
Well, you gave a lot of your bargaining chips away, right? The reality is that how many meetings did Manchin have on the infrastructure bill, right? It was important to him. Those states, it was very important to him. And yet at the end of the day, you gave all your bargain chips away last year. Now you're pushing it, but they didn't already got what they want, right? So the reality
is— You're saying what should have happened is when they were passing infrastructure, he should have gotten commitments from Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin on voting rights, and it should have been, leveraged at that time. Now infrastructure's passed; they've gotten what they wanted. They don't feel compelled to give him what he wants.
Don't feel it at all. And the reality is have Biden reached across the aisle enough to talk to people? Now, according to Romney and other states, U.S. senators, they said they have not had that meeting. But yet at the end of the day, That's what we are dealing with. There are people like the senator from Maine, the senator from Alaska, people in the past that we've been able to get to switch their vote, right? Of course, the last U.S. Congress, we got an actual senator to reject their own party by not repealing the Affordable Care Act. At the end of the day,
but let me ask you this, and these are all very legitimate points, and we have seen some of those Republicans cross the aisle, but we're leading up to a midterm now. We're leading up to Republicans smelling blood, smelling the opportunity to take back the House. Kevin McCarthy is just, he's ironing his suits, getting them ready to be the speaker. He's rolling out his platform. He's talking about who he's going to put on committees, who he's going to take off committee. I mean, he's in planning mode to be the speaker.
Correct.
So is it fair again to say right now, those Republicans, Maine, Alaska, even, Utah, Romney, might have been willing to budge, but 5 months out from midterms, when they can sense that they could take back the House and the Senate, is it realistic to think that they're going to give any win to the Dems? Because it's feeling like to me that this is all about hang together Republicans, defeat the Dems on everything, take back the House and the Senate, and then just roll back everything that we won.
Well, one of the things about Romney and the Alaska senator and the Maine senator, they have always been the wild ones out of the bunch, right? Romney does not directly tie his success towards the Republican Party. He has always been such of an outsider, a person that sits on this aisle. So I'm willing to have more of the dialogue and the conversation. But at the end of the day, like I tell people, we have to do something. Because here come November, the state of Texas, places like Georgia, in areas, and even Ohio, you can kiss the baby on it. They will elect a Republican with these areas of suppression. And here,
let me ask you this, Minister. You just raised a good point. Have the activists, we know all the vitriol that's been directed at Manchin and Sinema and all the pressure, but have the activists been having those conversations with Romney? With Maine, with Alaska, those Republicans that have shown some interest in the past of passing legislation not along party lines. Have the activists been talking to them?
I'm glad you said that, because in the month of August, we had a meeting with each one of those senators. And we also had a meeting with House Leader McCarthy. We had those meetings and those discussions, but even at that time when we was trying to put pressure on the president was not talking about these issues. They were delaying it. They was pushing it back after infrastructure. And yet at the end of the day, most of because one of the things I tell people all the time, we can get the Freedom to Vote Act, right? We can get it signed today, but we needed it in enough time for the DOJ and other nonprofit law organizations to actually be able to challenge the laws in the state of Texas, in Georgia, and different things of that nature. And I know, Areva, you understand the legal process better than me. I'm no attorney, but at the end of the day, you can get the legislation, but we still got to go to court, right? You know what I mean? And actually,
legislation passed. The Dems are going to be filing lawsuits. The Republicans are going to be challenging it. It's going to run its little butt right into the Supreme Court, this 6-3 majority. Okay, we can't end this conversation on us being sunk, because that's how I'm feeling. Like, oh my God, every time I have this conversation. So where do we go, Pastor? We got what we got. He did it late, according to the activists. He didn't leverage infrastructure. He's trying to lean in now. Some of y'all say it's too little, too late. I ain't even going to your rally, Mr. President. We don't want to hear from you. But we know that if we implode and fall apart today, literally Donald Trump could be the president of the United States in 2024. And Kevin McCarthy, Mitch is probably out because he's not radical enough for Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has called him an idiot and everything else. So
yeah, he's probably gone.
Jim Jordan is, let's say we got Jim Jordan, Jim Jordan's clone in the Senate. So what do? We mad at you, President, but we gotta hang with him. We don't have a choice, do we?
Yeah, I think right now, even for many people who find themselves in these conservative controlled states, is that what we have to do is support the organizations who are doing the grassroots work. I would echo the words of Cliff Albright, because I believe that the change that we have been able to see has been done by grassroots organizers and people who have taken the mantle. And I salute the work of Black Voters Matter and all of the people who have traveled across this country towards organizing. We have to do the impossible. We have to go in rural Texas and make sure that people get out to vote, do the work. But we need the American people's support, because that's what we're going to have to do. Now, we're trying to make this stuff easier for us by passing these legislations. But at the end of the day, organizers like our organization, the Next Generation Action Network, and several other organizations throughout the state of Texas, throughout the country, are going to do what we always been doing, hitting the pavement, boots on the ground, continuing the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer and others.
Yeah, no, and I applaud you guys for doing that work. Obviously, such important work. And I would just say, we gotta come together. We gotta have that kumbaya moment with our president and our vice president, because we cannot afford to have, people already are gonna be mad about those gas prices. They're mad about those milk prices, those bread. So there's enough for folks to be mad about, even if they're not
Right.
tracking on voting rights.
Right.
And we know that can be extremely detrimental to Democrats up and down the ticket, not just the White House, because we're not just talking about, the White House or the U.S. Senate. We're talking about Dems up and down the ballot, which is why we're getting some of these repressive laws, is because we don't have enough Dems in these state legislatures. We don't have enough Dem governors to veto these repressive laws. So we got to get Stacey Abrams elected. So we can't have folks sitting at home mad at Biden and Harris. We got to get them they got to elect Stacey. I mean, so we got a lot of work to do. So y'all let me know when y'all gonna kiss and make up, because we got work to do.
We got a lot of work to do, but I think, Areva, one of the things is that you can hold someone yet accountable, but also control the messaging and make sure people and educate people on the difference between us holding the Biden administration accountable, but also finishing the work and finishing the job, and actually educating people why it's important to get a person named Stacey Abrams elected. Why is it important? Because Georgia and Texas has a contentious governor's race right now. Beto O'Rourke is running for Texas governor right now. So these are going to be showdowns that's going to go on in November, and we have to show the difference between it. But organizations such like many organizations that they have seen in the past are going to be on the front line towards making sure that we educate people.
Yeah, no, and that's important. We're talking about a nuanced message. I'm just going to stand up for my president and vice president. I'm a rep for them. I know y'all mad at me, but
it's cool.
I think about what we went through under Donald Trump. And you could be the dog catcher, but and Biden and Harris are much more than the dog catcher. But
hey, they better? Hey, listen, they better than Trump. And yet, at the end of the day, we just got to do the work. We have to be the person that hold it to the ground and hold them yet accountable.
Okay, I got to ask you one last question though before I let you go. I got a question for you.
Yes.
Is there any argument? Or tell me what the argument is. If you could go back now, you met with those Republican senators in August. If there's a meeting coming up in the next week or so, we're trying to revive this voting rights legislation. What's the argument today to those three senators, Republican senators?
The argument today is that what is history going to write about you, right? And the reality is that we know the history of this country. Even if you take the president's speech, right? He was very documented on how LBJ was able to get bipartisanship in doing the voting rights.
So the argument to them is how they're going to be remembered in history. Let's say they don't care about that. Is there another argument that you think resonates with them?
Well, one thing about it, I know that Romney is a man of legacy, and that's one of the things important to him. But yet, at the end of the day, I don't think Romney or this Republican Party, I try to challenge their soul. Most of them don't want Trump elected, right? Most of them actually want the Republican Party to be based what they thought the Republican Party was post-Trump, right? So we're challenging their heart, and most of them know what their colleagues is doing. From one moment on January 6th, Leader McCarthy and Mitch McConnell was calling out Trump, pointing the finger. 3 days later, they had switched up, went to tea with them. So we have to challenge their heart, right? And we got to bring that out because we know that they don't want. Trump talks about Romney worse than anybody he probably talks about. So at the end of the day, we have to challenge their heart and say, man, look, after everything that we went through, after where this country has been, I think that y'all can come up with a president much better, but I believe that is not going to be done if people's vote is suppressed. So at the end of the day, do you want to be remembered in the party of hate, or do you want to be remembered of the party of liberation, of the party of whatever, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So you have to challenge the heart.
Clearly, you know, we're going to end this on Dr. King. Clearly, Dr. King would have been talking to these senators about, you know, the morality, about the morality,
moral compass,
laws, and the immoral
Correct.
state of the laws that have been passed. And
Correct.
he's always reminded us that, you know, the moral arc of justice is long, you know, the moral arc is long, but it bends towards justice. So Dr. King would be right there with you, making.
Yeah, he will be arguing the moral compass. Yeah, he will be going to their heart. He will be arguing the moral compass right now, and that's what I strongly believe. And I think that's what his children said over the weekend. They challenged their heart. They was focused on their heart in making sure that the moral compass and the argument come to these people, and that's what we did yesterday at AT&T.
Well, congratulations to you, Minister. Always a pleasure to see you. Keep up.
Thank you for having me,
Reverend Alexander. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. We'll be talking soon because obviously there's going to be a lot going on between now and June in these midterm elections.
Yes, ma'am.
Continue to lift up Dr. King and the great work that you are doing in the vein of Dr. King. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
All right. I want to thank all my guests today. Oh, what an interesting and always enlightening conversation to talk to folks who are on the ground, those who are studying the history and those who are making the history by doing the work. I want to just thank them for the great work they're doing. Thanks to everyone who took some time out of their busy schedule over the last weekend to acknowledge and reflect on Dr. King. I love what Dr. Hill said is, you know, it's not about a prayer meeting or a breakfast or a lunch or even a parade. It's about examining whether we are living up to the ideas, the principles that Dr. King not just stood for, but which he gave his life for. And, you know, there can be no doubt about what Dr. King stood for, even though we've gotten this whitewashed, sanitized version of his history. There's so many books out there. Tavis Smiley's written a great book. Dr. Cornel West and so many other historians have written books that really put the life of Dr. King in its proper context and give us all of those layers, all of those complexities, and particularly those last years of his life where he did move towards challenging America on this capitalism, on its militarism, and on racism, and very, very poignantly and powerfully talked about how America had to confront the ills of capitalism and how it had to prioritize the disenfranchised, the marginalized, and that Poor People's Campaign, which Reverend Dr. Barber, who's been on this show, and his partner have continued the Poor People's Campaign, lifting up those people, the least of these in our community. Just some words to live by. You know, before I get out, if you didn't know, now you know. You've seen it on a special report. You have the books, the receipts are out there. You know that Dr. King was a complex human being like all of us. He had his flaws, yes, and you'll read some negative history about him and I don't know, some stuff about women, and I want to minimize that, but obviously he was a human being and he had his flaws just like all of us. We're not going to judge his life on what he did wrong. We're going to judge it on what he did right. And he did a whole lot of right. He also believed in fighting for what was morally right, including using civil disobedience. So for folks who say Dr. King wouldn't support Black Lives Matter and the activists today, I think they're wrong. I think they're dead wrong. Dr. King, as Dr. Hill reminded us, believed in confrontation. He believed in challenging the systems. So I hope the radical Dr. King inspires us all. It inspires us out of our silence and out of our complicity. And many of us are complicit. We're complicit with white nationalists. We're complicit with liberal whites who say the time is not now. We're complicit with those who say that we should maintain the status quo. And even those who say we should return this country back to some mythical time when America was great. We know America can be great, but it hasn't been great, and it won't be great until it lives up to the promises, the principles, and the values of Dr. King. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Wear your mask, get your booster, and remember, we're all in this together.